The red and blue lights bled across the dark asphalt, flickering against the side of the black sedan like restless shadows. It was just after 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the only other sounds in the empty stretch of county road were the faint hum of crickets and the uneven click of approaching boots. Calvin Bryant's hands stayed on the steering wheel, 10 and 2, the way every driver's ed instructor said to do it. His eyes flicked to the side mirror. The officer coming toward him moved like he had already decided what the ending was going to be. Ethan Miller, County Patrol, mid-30s, heavy-set under his reflective vest, didn't bother with the usual license and registration. He stopped 2 feet from the driver's side door and tilted his flashlight just enough to throw a beam straight into Calvin's eyes. "Roll the window all the way down," he ordered. Calvin lowered it slowly, voice even. "Evening, officer, what's the issue?" Ethan smirked faintly, the kind of smirk that said, "I've got you pegged." "Issue is you were drifting over the center line back there. That, and this car doesn't exactly look like it belongs to you." Calvin's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Drifting? The road's got no lane markings for the last mile." Ethan shrugged, flashlight beam steady on Calvin's face. "Still my job to check, license and registration." Calvin reached for his wallet slowly, narrating each move. "License in my back pocket, registration's in the glove box." Ethan's hand rested on the butt of his holstered pistol, casual but deliberate. "Go slow." The ID slid out first. Ethan didn't even glance at the name before holding it up to the light like he was checking for counterfeit bills. Birmingham address. Long way from home. "I'm here on court business," Calvin said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Court business? You a lawyer?" Calvin paused just long enough for it to be noticeable. "Something like that." Behind them, the sharp wash of headlights signaled another car pulling over to the shoulder. A silver sedan, 2 women inside. One of them, Holly Bennett, worked at the county clerk's office and recognized Calvin immediately. The other, her cousin Jessica Morgan, was already pulling out her phone. Ethan didn't notice them yet. He was too busy circling toward the front of Calvin's car, shining his light across the dashboard. "Mind stepping out for me?" Calvin's voice stayed calm. "Am I being detained?" "Not yet," Ethan said, "but that can change real quick." The words weren't loud, but they carried the kind of edge that made Jessica's grip tighten on her phone. Holly leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "That's Judge Bryant," she whispered. Jessica's eyebrows shot up. "From the appellate court?" Holly nodded, her stomach sinking. "And he's here for the qualified immunity hearing tomorrow." Ethan rapped his knuckles on the hood, then came back to the driver's door. "Step out." Calvin took a breath and opened the door slowly. His right knee twinged as he stood, a leftover injury from his days as a public defender running between courthouses and community meetings. He leaned slightly on the door for balance. Ethan's eyes flicked down, catching the subtle limp. "Got an injury there?" "Just old wear and tear," Calvin replied. Ethan's smirk returned, sharper this time. "Better hope you're not too fragile for a little search." Across the shoulder, Clarence Reed, an off-duty deputy heading home from the gym, slowed his truck as he passed the scene. He knew Calvin, not personally, but enough to know the man had just been appointed to review several high-profile qualified immunity appeals. And now here he was, under the flashlight of a patrol officer who clearly didn't know whose career he was playing with. Clarence pulled over and stepped out, hands visible. "Evening, Miller. Everything okay here?" Ethan glanced over, visibly irritated. "All good, Reed. Just checking out a suspicious vehicle." Clarence's gaze slid to Calvin. "Suspicious how?" Ethan jerked his chin toward the sedan. "Guy's acting cagey. Says he's here for court." Clarence's voice flattened slightly. "That guy is—" "Reed," Calvin interrupted quietly, eyes steady. "Let's just let this play out." It was the tone of someone who was collecting every word, every gesture, like pieces on a chessboard. Jessica Morgan had her camera rolling now, the small red record light glowing against the dark interior of her car. She zoomed in just enough to catch Ethan's posture, the slight lean forward, the flashlight beam fixed on Calvin's chest. "Mind telling me what exactly you're looking for?" Calvin asked. "Just making sure nothing's out of place," Ethan said, circling to the rear of the vehicle. "You a juror or something?" Calvin's lips twitched in the barest hint of irony. You could say that. Ethan chuckled. Well, juror number whatever, you're on my time now. Holly's knuckles whitened around her coffee cup. Jessica muttered under her breath, He's going to regret that. Calvin stood still, letting the weight of the silence stretch between them. Every second that passed was another second Ethan didn't realize he was writing his own career obituary. The night air had that brittle, late-autumn bite to it, each breath hanging briefly in the glow of the cruiser's headlights before fading. Calvin stood beside his car, hands visible, eyes following Ethan Miller's slow circle like a man watching a dog sniff around a yard it didn't belong in. From the shoulder, Jessica Morgan adjusted her phone for a better angle. Holly Bennett leaned forward, whispering, He hasn't even radioed in the plate. He's fishing. Ethan stopped at the trunk, ran the beam of his flashlight across the rear window, then stepped back to Calvin. Where exactly are you coming from tonight? Downtown, Calvin said evenly. Doing what? Calvin tilted his head slightly. You pulled me over for drifting, not for an itinerary. Ethan's jaw tightened. You get smart with me. This stop gets a whole lot longer. Across the road, another pair of headlights slowed, a dark SUV pulling onto the gravel shoulder. Out stepped Andre Parker, a local business owner who recognized Calvin from an editorial in the county paper. Andre was still in his work jacket, phone already in hand as he approached the small crowd forming near the edge of the asphalt. What's going on here? Andre asked, his tone neutral but his eyes locked on Ethan. Ethan turned, posture stiffening. Sir, this is a traffic stop. Move along. Andre didn't budge. Not until I know why you've got him out of the car. Suspicious behavior, Ethan said flatly. Andre's eyebrows lifted. Suspicious? He's standing still. You're the one circling him. Clarence Reed, still parked nearby, stepped closer, his voice calm but edged. Miller, maybe just run the plate and be done. I'll run it when I'm ready, Ethan snapped. Calvin's voice slid back in, calm enough to cut through the tension. You've had my license for 5 minutes. Running it takes 30 seconds. You're choosing not to. Ethan looked like he was about to respond when Jessica's voice rang out from her car. I've got the whole thing on video. The words hit the air like a dropped match. Ethan turned toward her, his tone icy. Ma'am, if you interfere with this stop, filming from my vehicle isn't interference, Jessica shot back. Calvin's eyes stayed on Ethan, his voice dropping low enough for just them to hear. You've got an audience now. Choose your next step carefully. Ethan's smirk was gone. He took a half step back, scanning the small knot of people and cameras around them. Fine, let's see what we've got. He walked back to his cruiser, slid into the driver's seat, and finally keyed in the license number. The screen blinked twice, then displayed the registration. He read it, frowned slightly, then typed something else into the system. Calvin watched him through the side mirror. Ethan's frown deepened. Clarence took the opportunity to move closer to Calvin. I know you wanted to let this play out, he said quietly, but it's going sideways fast. Calvin shook his head faintly. It's exactly where I need it to be. Andre caught that exchange, his brow furrowing. You planning to drop something on him? Calvin's eyes didn't leave the cruiser. When the time's right, Ethan stepped out again, closing the cruiser door with more force than necessary. All right, here's the deal. You're gonna pop the trunk for me. Why? Calvin asked. Because I'm telling you to, Ethan said, leaning in slightly. Calvin didn't move. Do you have probable cause? Ethan's voice sharpened. Don't play lawyer with me. Andre let out a short laugh. You really don't know who you're talking to, do you? Ethan shot him a glare. Stay out of it. Holly Bennett finally stepped out of her car, clutching her coffee cup. Officer, maybe you should call this in before you... Ethan turned on her. Ma'am, get back in your car. Holly didn't. Or maybe you should just let him go because you're about to make the kind of mistake people don't come back from. Jessica's camera stayed trained on the scene. Her voice was steady now, carrying clearly over the idling engine noise. Everything you're saying is going on record. Ethan's breathing was heavier now, his voice louder, as if volume could push back against the tide turning against him. Last chance, open the trunk. Calvin's answer was quiet, deliberate. No. For a second, all you could hear was the hiss of passing tires from a distant highway. Then Ethan took a step back, hand brushing the top of his holster. "All right, have it your way." Clarence stepped forward immediately. "Miller, I've got it handled," Ethan snapped. "No," Clarence said, firmer this time, "you really don't." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Calvin finally shifted, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It means every second you've spent here has been recorded by multiple witnesses, and by the person you're threatening." Ethan tilted his head, suspicious. "And who's that?" Calvin didn't answer yet. He just let the question hang there, heavy and unanswered, as the lights from another approaching vehicle lit up the scene. The new headlights washed the scene in a cold glare, brighter than the first cruiser. A second patrol unit rolled up and angled across the shoulder, front tires kissing the white gravel. The door opened and a taller officer stepped out, duty jacket zipped high, radio clipped against his shoulder like a second voice. Sergeant Daniel Pierce took in the spread with a single sweep. One driver out of his car, one officer squared up and tense, 3 civilians filming from the shoulder, an off-duty deputy standing too close to be a spectator. "Report it later," he thought. "Control it now." "Evening," he said, voice clipped. "What do we have?" Ethan answered without looking away from Calvin. "Suspicious vehicle, failure to comply, possible refusal of a lawful search." Clarence Reed replied before Calvin could. "Negative on that. There is no probable cause for a trunk search. Driver has provided license and registration. You never articulated anything beyond drifting and a feeling." Sergeant Pierce cut a look at him. "You on duty, Reed?" "Off duty," Clarence said. "Still a deputy, still trained to hear what is and is not in policy." Jessica tightened the frame on her phone, the mic catching the edges of every sentence. Holly stepped closer to Andre, voice low but steady. "That sergeant is going to circle the wagons for Miller. Watch." Ethan jerked his chin at Calvin. "He has not explained why he is here or where he is going." Calvin met Pierce's eyes. "I am here on court business. I am going exactly where this county expects me to be at 9 in the morning." Pierce's gaze slid to the sedan. "Registration valid?" "Valid and current," Calvin said. "Your officer just ran it." Ethan bristled. "That is not the point." "It is exactly the point," Andre said from the shoulder. Pierce lifted a palm toward the crowd. "Enough. Everyone maintain distance." Jessica did not move the phone. "Distance is fine. The First Amendment is fine too." Ethan took a breath like he might push the edge again. Calvin watched the man's jaw work, the way his eyes kept darting to the cameras and then back to the holster, as if the presence of both required him to prove something. He had seen that posture in court. He had seen it break people who did not have witnesses. Sergeant Pierce turned back to Calvin. "Why were you drifting?" "The county stopped painting lines on that stretch," Calvin said. "The wind moved me an inch and your officer turned it into a fishing trip." Pierce's eyes hardened. "Sir, step back to the bumper." Calvin did not argue. He took 2 measured steps and stopped with the red glow of the taillight warming the edge of his suit coat. Ethan pivoted toward the trunk again. "You will open it now." "No," Calvin said. "Articulate probable cause." Ethan's voice rose. "You are refusing a lawful order." "Lawful requires a lawful basis," Calvin replied. "You do not have it." Sergeant Pierce shifted his stance. "We can sort probable cause at the station." Clarence's tone flattened. "Or you can sort it here before you violate the man's rights on camera," Ethan snapped. "Reed, back off." Andre said it loud enough for every mic. "Incredible. You are trying to bully a man in front of 5 cameras and an off-duty deputy." Holly's voice cut in. "And the county clerk's office will be very interested in why you kept a driver out of his car for 15 minutes without a single clear reason." Ethan swung to her. "Ma'am, back to your vehicle." She held his stare. "No." The sergeant's radio cracked to life. "Units, be advised, tomorrow morning is the appellate calendar at the county courthouse special session. Visiting dignitaries expected. Increase visibility near the square." Pierce's expression did not change, but he keyed his mic and turned away. "Copy." Calvin watched him listen. The line between ignorance and knowledge is one dispatch away, he thought. He let the silence sit a second longer and then spoke, not loud, but with a weight that moved the space around them. "Sergeant, I am going to resolve this without anybody losing their temper. Your officer is going to return my license. He is going to explain his warning very clearly. Then I am going to leave. If you push past that, we are going to spend the rest of the night writing statements and the rest of the month reading them aloud." Ethan laughed, sharp and humorless. "Statements? From who?" "Juror number 7. The words landed and rolled. Jessica's eyebrows jumped. Holly's mouth opened, the disbelief plain. Andre let out a breath that sounded like a fuse catching. Calvin did not flinch. He let the taunt sit where it fell and answered it with the plainest truth in the lot. "I am not a juror." Ethan's smirk deepened. "Sure you are. Juror number 7, the quiet one, the one who thinks rules are optional." Clarence took a step toward Ethan, voice held on a tight line. "Stop talking." The second cruiser's spotlight clicked brighter, bleaching the trunk lid and the back window. It made the air feel thinner. It made every move count. Sergeant Pierce put a hand out, palm toward Ethan's chest. "Hold!" He turned to Calvin again. "Step to the front of the car." Calvin did not move. "I will stand here. My hands are visible. Your cameras are rolling. Clarify your grounds." Ethan's hand settled on the top of the holster again, thumb tapping once. Andre raised his phone higher. Jessica widened her frame until she had all 3 men and both cruisers in view. A dark sedan eased onto the shoulder 100 feet back. Its hazard lights blinked twice. The driver's door opened, and a man in a navy suit stepped out, coat unbuttoned against the cold. Christopher Palmer, district attorney for the neighboring county, had been driving home from a late meeting when he saw the lights. He knew that road. He knew who was due in his courthouse in the morning. He did not like coincidences. Palmer approached with hands visible. "Evening, is there a problem?" Sergeant Pierce kept his posture controlled. "We have it handled." Palmer's eyes moved from Pierce to Ethan to Calvin. His voice softened half a degree. "Judge Bryant." Holly exhaled like she had been holding her breath for a minute. Jessica's camera dipped and came back up, catching Calvin's stillness and the tiny shift in Ethan's face as the name slid across the pavement toward him. Ethan blinked. "Judge." Calvin's tone stayed even. "Mr. Palmer, good evening." Palmer nodded once to Calvin and then looked straight at Pierce. "This is a sitting appellate judge. He is here to review qualified immunity cases. He will be on the bench at 9. Silence moved through the line of gravel like a wind nobody could see. Ethan's mouth opened, then shut. The smirk drained. The radio hissed quietly in the gap. Sergeant Pierce's jaw flexed. He kept his voice level. "We pulled him for drifting. Then you issue a warning and send him on his way," Palmer replied. "You do not circle him for 15 minutes and invent a search." Ethan found his voice. He was evasive. Calvin spoke before Palmer could. "I was precise. I asked for the cause. You ignored the question. That is not evasive. That is the record." Jessica's video caught every word. Andre's did too. A driver in a pickup that had slowed to pass rolled down his window and called across the dark, "Y'all treating a judge like that?" The pickup eased on, but the sentence hung there. Sergeant Pierce finally addressed Ethan without looking at him. "Return the license." Ethan did not move. Pierce's tone sharpened. "Now." Ethan walked back to the cruiser, opened the door with a stiff hand, and pulled the card from the dash pocket. He returned to the rear bumper, held the license out, and waited. Calvin did not make him wait. He took it and slid it back into his wallet with the same careful movements he had used at the start. Palmer stayed close. "I will need both of your names and badge numbers for my notes," he said, looking at Pierce and then at Ethan. Pierce answered evenly. "Sergeant Daniel Pierce, badge 451. Ethan's voice came out flatter than he intended. "Officer Ethan Miller, badge 226. Jessica repeated the numbers into her mic. Andre typed them into a note on his phone. Holly said them under her breath like a teacher memorizing a list. Calvin spoke again, still controlled, still soft. "Sergeant, you are going to articulate the basis for your stop. You are going to do it into your body mic. You are going to do it clearly. Then you are going to conclude this encounter." Pierce keyed his radio and recorded the basics. Vehicle observed drifting on an unmarked stretch. Driver compliant. license verified, registration valid, no indicators of impairment, no contraband observed, warning issued. He let go of the mic. His eyes found Ethan's. That is how you close. Ethan's throat worked. He ooked like a man realizing the room had more doors than he planned for, and every one of them led to a report. Calvin glanced toward Clarence. "Thank you for staying." Clarence nodded once. "You had enough eyes on it. I just wanted one of them to wear a badge." Palmer stepped back toward his sedan. "Judge, we have security arranged for the morning. I will make a few calls tonight." Calvin's voice shifted half an inch. "No need to add more heat to the courthouse. What we need is accuracy." Palmer understood. He always did. He looked at Pierce. "Ensure this recording is preserved. If it disappears, there will be more lights than this road has seen in a year." Pierce's answer was steady. "It will be preserved." Ethan's gaze fell to the pavement. The bravado had drained away. What was left looked like someone who was hearing the word consequence without anyone having to say it. Calvin turned back to his car. He did not rush. He did not dramatize the moment. He opened the door, placed both hands on the top edge, and paused for a beat that felt like a closing argument no one wanted to hear. "Officer Miller," he said, "thank you for the warning. Tomorrow, I will hear arguments about whether officers who act without a lawful basis should be shielded from accountability. I recommend you get some sleep." He sat, closed the door, and the sedan's engine hummed back to life like a quiet verdict. The taillights glowed against the gravel. The car pulled away with the calm inevitability of a gavel coming down. Jessica lowered her phone, breath catching. Holly stared at the road where the sedan had been, then looked at Andre. "Did that just happen?" Andre nodded slowly. "It did, and the internet is about to know it did." Clarence returned to his truck. Palmer eased his sedan back onto the road. The night took a breath, the noise of the insects returning like a faint chorus. On the shoulder, under the cooling wash of the cruiser's lights, Sergeant Pierce stood with his hands on his belt and looked at Ethan. "This is going to be a long week." Ethan swallowed and said nothing. The scene folded itself back into darkness, but it did not end. It only moved. It followed the judge into town. It rode the digital wave Jessica had already launched. It waited at the courthouse doors where the next morning's docket would change from words on a page to a line in the sand. Tomorrow, 9 sharp. Qualified immunity on the calendar. Juror number 7 was never a juror at all. He was the one person in the county who would read every comma of what just happened and decide what counted as a shield and what counted as a mask. And now everyone knew it. The engine's hum was steady as Calvin Bryant steered the sedan toward the quiet streets leading into the county seat. The taillights of Christopher Palmer's car had already disappeared ahead, and the glow of the courthouse clock tower was just a faint outline in the dark. The road unwound under his tires, but his thoughts were back 25 years, in a courtroom where he wasn't the one in robes. Calvin had been born on the south side of Montgomery, Alabama, the youngest of 3 in a house where the TV was always tuned to the news. His father, Arthur Bryant Sr., had been a postal worker for 32 years, the kind of man who wore his uniform pressed even on the hottest days. His mother, Denise, taught American history at a public high school, and she never let her youngest forget the weight of the law in shaping the country's story. At 16, Calvin was volunteering at the local library when a public defender named Harold Gaines stopped in to pick up trial transcripts. Gaines noticed the teenager had a knack for remembering case names and dates, even without looking at the paper. "You've got a mind for the record," Gaines had said. "That's rare. Most folks only care about the verdict." That was the first seed. By the time Calvin graduated high school, he had earned a scholarship to Howard University, majoring in political science. His years there were split between lectures, working nights at a legal aid clinic, and taking summer internships at small law offices in D.C. He learned quickly that the courtroom wasn't about who shouted loudest. It was about who controlled the story. After law school, he went straight into defense work, not because it was easy, but because it was uphill. His first decade was spent representing clients who couldn't afford private counsel. It meant sitting in holding cells at 2 a.m., explaining to someone's grandmother why bail had been set at an impossible figure, and walking into arraignments knowing the odds were stacked before the gavel dropped. In 2008, Calvin took a pro bono case for a young man accused of resisting arrest during a traffic stop. The officer's body cam had malfunctioned. 3 witnesses said the man had complied. The judge dismissed the civil rights complaint against the officer under qualified immunity, the legal doctrine shielding government officials from personal liability unless they violated clearly established rights. Calvin lost that case, but he didn't forget it. Over the next 5 years, he tracked every qualified immunity ruling in his circuit, building a quiet dossier. He saw patterns, the same justifications appearing in rulings, the same language recycled. Each time, the shield held. In 2015, Governor Elaine Warren appointed him to the County Superior Court bench. The move put him in civil rights territory more often, and it put him one step closer to the appellate seat. By 2022, when a vacancy opened on the state appellate court, Calvin's record was clean, his reversal rate low, and his courtroom reputation that of a man who would listen to every word before deciding which ones mattered. The confirmation hearing was a formality. Even his political opponents admitted he was hard to rattle. 1 year later, the docket landed on his desk. A series of appeals challenging the application of qualified immunity in use of force cases, one of them from the very county he was driving through tonight. The irony was sharp. The same law he'd fought against in 2008 would now pass under his review, with the power to affirm or dismantle its reach in his jurisdiction. Tomorrow morning's hearing wasn't just another line on the court calendar. The cases had drawn national press because of their implications. Whether officers accused of violating rights without a clear precedent could still avoid trial. Advocacy groups had already filed amicus briefs. Law enforcement unions had packed the courthouse gallery at preliminary hearings. And here he was, hours before taking the bench, standing on the shoulder of a rural road while a patrolman called him Juror number 7 and demanded to search his trunk without cause. Calvin knew what that looked like in the broader conversation. He also knew better than to let that knowledge show on his face at the scene. The video Jessica Morgan had captured tonight would circulate before sunrise. And when it did, it wouldn't just be about one stop, it would be about the very doctrine he was there to review. From the day he'd taken the appellate oath, Calvin had kept one personal rule: never become the story. Judges couldn't afford it, but sometimes the story found you. And when it did, you handled it the same way you handled a courtroom. Keep your voice steady, keep the record clean, and never give away your strategy until the moment it matters most. That's why he'd let Ethan Miller dig himself deeper at the roadside. Why he hadn't invoked his title until Palmer arrived. Why he'd answered every question with precision instead of heat. Because the road didn't end at the shoulder. It curved straight into tomorrow's docket. The sedan rolled past the courthouse square now, its tall windows dark, the flag out front still in the cold wind. Calvin slowed at the corner, eyes flicking to the steps where protesters had stood during the last high-profile trial. He wondered how many of them would be back by morning. His phone buzzed in the console. A message from Palmer. "We'll have a quiet room for you before the hearing. Let me know if you need security in the garage." Calvin typed back, "No security, just accuracy." The courthouse was still an hour away when Calvin's phone buzzed again, this time with an unknown number. He let it go to voicemail, eyes fixed on the 2-lane ribbon of asphalt ahead. When it rang a second time, he answered. "Judge Bryant?" The voice was measured, professional. "Jessica Morgan. We haven't met, but I was at the roadside tonight. I've already sent the video to a couple of people you might want to know about." Calvin kept his tone neutral. "Who's seen it?" "My cousin works at a local station. She's holding it for now, but there's chatter on social media. Andre Parker's clip is already past 2,000 views, and it's been less than an hour." He didn't reply right away. He could picture the footage. Light glare from the cruisers, his own silhouette standing beside the sedan, Ethan Miller's voice cutting through the dark. All of it time-stamped. Jessica's voice softened. "You handled it. People need to see that." He thanked her, kept the call short, and set the phone back in its cradle. The quiet in the car returned, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like the pause between dominoes tipping. Behind him, the patrol cars had long since peeled away, but he knew Miller was replaying every word in his head. Pierce, too, and by morning, so would people who had the power to read that stop into the record in ways neither officer had considered. Another buzz. This time, it was Palmer. FYI, someone just tipped the county sheriff's office that the stop was on you. They're scrambling. Expect a call from the chief deputy before midnight. The call came sooner than that. The voice on the other end was trying for casual, but it carried the edge of someone who understood that formality wasn't going to smooth this over. Judge, I want to personally assure you that what happened out there doesn't reflect department policy. We'll review the body cam footage. I'm sure you will, Calvin said, his voice even. Make sure it stays intact. The line went quiet for half a second before the deputy promised it would. By the time he crossed the county line, Jessica's video had doubled in views. Andre's clip was moving just as fast, the comments section a steady mix of outrage and recognition. People who'd been stopped on that same stretch of road chimed in. Stories of routine checks that stretched half an hour for no reason, of flashlights lingering too long on skin tone instead of license plates. Calvin read none of them. His focus was on the work ahead. Briefs stacked in his chambers, the questions he'd put to counsel in the morning, the precedent lines he intended to test. But he also knew that by the time the hearing began, half the gallery would have already seen exactly how one of those cases starts. Not in the courtroom, not with a lawyer at a podium, but on a cold roadside, under a tilted flashlight, with the quiet assumption that the man being questioned would bend before the officer's will. Tomorrow, that assumption would meet the record, and the record would decide which of them the law truly protected. The courthouse garage was nearly empty when he pulled in, the echo of his tires against the concrete walls following him all the way to the reserved row. He shut off the engine and let the silence settle. Above, the muffled thud of footsteps and the faint creak of old wood hinted at the cleaning crew making their rounds. He didn't go straight to chambers. Instead, he walked the long way through the underground corridor that connected the garage to the administrative wing. His phone vibrated twice in his coat pocket. Palmer again, then a number from Montgomery he recognized as a former colleague. He ignored both. By the time he reached the private elevator, another message had come in, this one from LaToya Green, a staff attorney he trusted to keep her ear to the ground. Videos on 3 community pages already. One of them's pushing for a formal complaint against Miller and Pierce. Someone tagged the state AG's office. He didn't need to reply. She'd know he'd read it. The elevator chimed and opened onto a dim hallway lined with framed photographs of past justices, each one frozen mid-career in black robes, unsmiling. Inside his office, he set the cane against the wall, loosened his tie, and dropped into the leather chair behind his desk. On the blotter, the next day's docket was already laid out, the stack of briefs neatly clipped. Case 4B, the one challenging qualified immunity in a traffic stop where the plaintiff alleged racial profiling, was circled in blue ink. He ran a hand over the page once, not reading, just feeling the weight of the paper. Outside, the wind pressed against the old windows, the building groaning like it remembered every hearing held within its walls. The phone rang again. This time he answered. Andre Parker's voice came through, low but urgent. Judge, you should know. Comments on my video aren't just strangers. Couple of them are deputies' family members, and one says this isn't the first time Miller's been caught on camera. Where? Calvin asked. 2 towns over, different uniform, same habit. Pulled over a local councilman, tried to search without cause. That one didn't go viral, but it's on record. Calvin made a note on the legal pad beside him, just a time and date. Send me what you have, already in your inbox. The call ended. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling where the faint hum of the building's heating system filled the quiet. Every move Ethan Miller had made tonight was now part of a larger pattern, one that might become relevant far sooner than the officer realized. Across the square, the lights in the district attorney's office burned past midnight. Palmer was likely on the phone with the sheriff by now, deciding how to manage a problem that had already slipped into the public eye. Calvin closed the docket folder, turned off the desk lamp, and sat in the dark for a moment longer. Tomorrow's questions would be pointed, the kind that required counsel to answer with more than rote citations. And somewhere in those answers, the law would have to decide if the shield it offered was meant to protect service or to excuse abuse. The courthouse was still asleep when he stepped outside just after 6, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs. Across the square, the bakery lights flickered on, spilling a warm stripe across the brick sidewalk. He could hear the distant hum of a delivery truck backing into an alley. His phone buzzed before he reached the curb. LaToya again. Media picked it up. State Journal running a short piece online. They haven't named you yet, but they know it's an appellate judge. He slipped the phone back into his pocket without responding. The moment his name appeared in print, the story would shift. It would no longer be about a citizen confronted on the roadside. It would become about the judge who would sit in judgment hours later. And that, he knew, would invite its own set of narratives. At the corner, he saw Jessica Morgan's silver sedan idling. She rolled the window down. "Didn't think you'd be out walking before the hearing," she said. "I always walk before big days," he replied. She glanced around as if to make sure no one was listening. "The video's over 10,000 views now. Comments are ugly. Some defending the officer, most not. People are posting their own stories from the same stretch of road. That's the pattern," he said quietly. Jessica hesitated. "Are you going to bring it up in court?" "Not unless the law brings it there first," he said, his eyes fixed on the courthouse steps. A county maintenance truck rumbled past, slowing near the flagpole. The driver, an older man in a canvas jacket, raised 2 fingers in greeting. Calvin nodded back, then watched as the truck disappeared down the side street. When he climbed the courthouse steps, he could feel the building waking, the echo of doors opening, the low voices of clerks swapping early news, the clatter of carts carrying boxes of files to the courtroom. In his chambers, LaToya was already waiting. She had a manila folder in hand and a guarded expression. "This is from the sheriff's office. Internal summaries on prior complaints against Miller. 3 in the last 5 years, all dismissed internally. 1 was another traffic stop. Same language in the report as last night." He took the folder without opening it. "Keep a clean copy off the network, just in case." She nodded once. "Understood." Downstairs, the gallery seats were filling. The first case was still 40 minutes away, but the benches were already half occupied by a mix of local reporters, legal observers, and uniformed officers. Even without checking, he knew at least some of them had seen the video. As he adjusted his robe and straightened the docket on the bench, the murmur in the room dimmed. Every hearing had a tone before it began. Today's was a blend of anticipation and calculation, like the air just before a storm front. He glanced once at the clock. In 5 minutes, the bailiff would call the first case, and the doctrine of qualified immunity would move from roadside theory to courtroom reality. The faces in front of him would argue precedent and policy. The people outside would argue something else entirely, and between them, the record would have to decide. The courtroom doors opened to a draft of cool air and the faint scent of polished wood. Calvin stepped through from chambers with his robe already on, his expression composed into the mask every judge learns early, present but unreadable. The bailiff followed 2 steps behind, voice carrying above the murmurs. "All rise." The shuffle of feet and the creak of benches filled the space as everyone stood. Calvin took his seat, adjusted the microphone, and glanced at the docket in front of him. Case 4B was third on the list, but the attorneys for both sides were already in the room. He could feel their eyes on him even when he wasn't looking directly their way. The first 2 matters moved quickly, one a procedural motion, the other a joint stipulation. But the air in the room changed as soon as the bailiff called the next case. Counsel for the appellant rose, suit crisp, voice steady. "May it please the court, We are here to challenge the trial court's dismissal under the doctrine of qualified immunity. The words rolled out in measured cadence, the kind of argument Calvin had heard hundreds of times. But today, every phrase carried a sharper edge in his mind. Clearly established law. Objective reasonableness. They were the same terms Miller had tried to twist on the roadside the night before, only now wrapped in precedent and citation. He asked his first question 10 minutes in, leaning forward slightly. Counsel, if an officer's justification shifts during the course of an encounter, at what point does that undermine the claim of objective reasonableness? The attorney hesitated just a beat. Your Honor, the courts have generally looked to the totality of the circumstances. Totality of the circumstances, Calvin repeated softly. But the record would need to reflect those circumstances accurately, yes? Yes, Your Honor. He let the silence that followed hang just long enough to make the point, then nodded for counsel to continue. From the gallery, Jessica Morgan sat near the back, her phone off but her attention sharp. Andre Parker was beside her, hands folded, eyes flicking between Calvin and the uniformed officers lining the side wall. Holly Bennett had slipped into a seat 2 rows ahead, a notepad balanced on her knee, though she wasn't writing. The appellee's counsel tried to pivot the argument toward the split-second nature of roadside decisions, citing cases where courts deferred heavily to officer judgment. Calvin listened, expression neutral, before asking, "And what safeguards exist to prevent that deference from excusing a rights violation when there is no contemporaneous record?" The attorney started to answer, but he raised a hand slightly. "Be specific. Hypotheticals won't do." The pause this time was longer. In that quiet, the echo of last night's cruiser lights and clipped commands seemed to pass through the room like an unseen shadow. When the answer came, it was careful, almost too careful. "Body-worn cameras, Your Honor. Independent witnesses. Consistent reports." Calvin nodded once. "Then our review must consider whether those things exist in the record before us, and if they do, whether they align." Pens scratched at the counsel tables. In the gallery, Jessica glanced at Andre, and he gave the faintest nod. They knew exactly what those words were reaching toward, even if no one else did yet. He let the argument run its course, each side trading citations before announcing a short recess. As the bailiff called for the court to stand, Calvin rose, eyes sweeping the room once. The hearing was only half over, but the record he wanted was already starting to form. In chambers, the door shut softly behind him, cutting off the low buzz of voices from the courtroom. LaToya was waiting by the side table, a fresh stack of papers in her hands. "They've moved the video," she said without preamble. "It's not just on community pages anymore. 2 regional outlets picked it up during the first argument. One of them has Miller's name in the headline." Calvin took the stack from her. It wasn't newsprint. It was printouts of online comments, organized by timestamp. Witness statements embedded in posts, a few even linking to old reports about Miller from other counties. The pattern was emerging in plain sight, the kind of thing appellate judges were trained to read like a map. LaToya kept her voice low. "Palmer's outside. He says the sheriff wants to make a public statement before lunch." He set the printouts on his desk. "The sheriff can do what he needs to do. This court is here to hear the case in front of it." "That's what I told him," she said, though her eyes lingered on the folder. "Still, everyone out there knows." He straightened a file on the blotter. "Knowing isn't the same as putting it in the record." A knock at the door. Palmer stepped in, suit jacket open, a crease of fatigue between his brows. "Judge, I won't take your time. Just know my office is formally reviewing the stop. That's separate from the case you're hearing, but—" He hesitated. "I don't think the two are unrelated in the public mind." "They rarely are," Calvin said. Palmer gave a small nod. "If you need a buffer when court adjourns, I'll make sure you have it." Calvin met his eye. "I won't need a buffer. I'll need the record to be clean." When Palmer left, Calvin sat for another moment in the quiet. The hum of the old HVAC system filled the space. Beyond the wall, He could faintly hear the bailiff instructing people to return to their seats. He stood, adjusted his robe, and headed back toward the bench. As he stepped through the side door into the courtroom, all heads turned, the air tightening again. The second half of the argument awaited, but now the weight in the room wasn't just the doctrine of qualified immunity, it was the knowledge that outside this courthouse, a real-life example of that doctrine's reach was playing out in real time. He took his seat. Let's proceed. The appellee's counsel rose again, shuffling a few fresh pages, clearly recalibrating from the recess. His voice carried a little faster now, as if he could feel the subtle shift in the room's temperature. Your Honor, the doctrine exists to ensure officers can perform their duties without the constant threat of litigation. Calvin leaned forward slightly, not interrupting, but locking eyes in a way that made the attorney's next words falter. And, the man continued, clearing his throat, it's important to remember that qualified immunity does not excuse misconduct when a reasonable officer would have known the conduct was unlawful. Which presumes, Calvin said evenly, that we can accurately determine what that conduct was. That requires a consistent factual record, does it not? Yes, Your Honor. Calvin let the point hang, his gaze shifting briefly toward the gallery where Jessica Morgan and Andre Parker sat motionless. The attorney pressed on, citing a series of decisions from the circuit, his tone steady but lacking the earlier confidence. Across the table, opposing counsel waited with a legal pad half filled with counterpoints, eyes flicking to Calvin after each citation as if gauging its weight. When the arguments closed, Calvin asked each side for a short supplemental brief addressing one question. What constitutes sufficient corroboration when objective reasonableness is disputed? His voice was calm, but the question's precision left no doubt it had been chosen for a reason. The attorneys agreed to submit within the week. He thanked them, then rose as the bailiff called the court into recess for the noon break. The sound of benches creaking and footsteps filling the aisles echoed against the high ceiling. Outside on the courthouse steps, the midday sun lit the square in sharp contrast to the cool marble interior. Reporters clustered at the bottom of the stairs, cameras ready. Calvin didn't slow as he descended, but the click of shutters followed him. Palmer was waiting at the curb, leaning against a black sedan. Sheriff went ahead and made his statement, he said as Calvin approached. He's calling it a regrettable misunderstanding and promising a review. Calvin opened the car door without looking up. Regret doesn't change a record. Palmer's lips pressed into a thin line. No, but sometimes it changes the outcome. Calvin didn't reply. He settled into the seat, closed the door, and let the city noise fade as they pulled away. Somewhere behind them, the cameras kept rolling, catching the image of a judge walking straight through the middle of a storm that wasn't finished brewing. The courtroom settled into a hushed rhythm as the afternoon session began. Sunlight angled through the high windows, casting long stripes across the polished floor. Calvin adjusted his glasses and scanned the bench book in front of him, the tabs marked with precise color-coded notes. Counsel for the appellant returned to the podium, posture straight, expression resolute. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to address a matter raised in the supplemental authorities provided before lunch. His voice was steady, but Calvin caught the flicker of a glance toward the gallery, where a few reporters had slipped in since the morning session. Proceed, Calvin said. The attorney launched into a discussion of a recent circuit case involving an officer who altered his account after body camera footage surfaced. As he outlined the parallels, Calvin listened without reaction. But in the gallery, Jessica Morgan's pen paused over her notebook. When opposing counsel stepped up, the shift was immediate. The appellant is asking this court to set aside a long-standing principle on the basis of unverified claims. Qualified immunity protects officers unless they violate clearly established law. Calvin raised his hand slightly. Counsel, the principle is not under review here. The application of that principle to the facts is, yes, Your Honor, but absent definitive proof. The question, Calvin interrupted, is what constitutes definitive proof in cases where the available evidence is incomplete or contested. If the officer's account changes, how should the court treat that discrepancy? The attorney hesitated, drawing in a breath. It depends on whether the change is material and whether it can be explained by the circumstances. Materiality, Calvin repeated, letting the word hang in the air. From the corner of his vision, he saw Andre Parker lean forward in his seat, the same attentive stillness he'd had on the roadside when the cruiser lights flashed. The exchange moved into case law, both sides citing decisions that seemed to contradict and overlap in equal measure. Calvin asked pointed questions, drawing out distinctions between policy-driven deference and fact-driven scrutiny. Each answer fed into the silent framework he was building in his mind. A sudden creak in the gallery made several heads turn. A latecomer had entered quietly, sliding into a seat at the back. He wore a dark jacket and kept his gaze fixed on the floor, but Calvin noted the way some of the uniformed officers glanced his way. Word was spreading faster than the docket could move. After another 40 minutes, Calvin announced a short break. The attorneys gathered their papers with brisk movements, their voices low. The bailiff's voice echoed against the paneled walls, instructing everyone to reconvene in 15 minutes. Calvin stepped down from the bench, the side door closing behind him with a muted click. The quiet on the other side felt almost jarring after the controlled tension of the courtroom. LaToya was waiting with a small stack of messages, each one time-stamped within the last half hour. 2 from the State Attorney General's office, she said. 1 from the presiding judge of the circuit, and she held up the last slip. A call from the sheriff's counsel asking if you'd be willing to meet before the end of the day. Calvin set the messages on his desk. Tell them all the same thing. The court doesn't meet outside the record. She nodded, her face impassive. Understood. In the distance, the muffled sounds of the gallery filtered through, voices rising and falling, the scrape of shoes on tile, the faint hum of speculation that no amount of closed doors could keep out. When Calvin returned to the bench, the room quieted instantly. The bailiff called the next case number and the attorneys resumed their places, their earlier confidence tempered by the precision of the morning's questioning. Counsel for the appellant began by addressing the central issue Calvin had emphasized before lunch: corroboration. Your Honor, the record shows discrepancies in the officer's account that were not clarified by the trial court. We submit that where such discrepancies exist, and where there is potential corroborating evidence that was disregarded, qualified immunity should not bar the claim. Calvin's pen moved once across the legal pad before him, a short note that he didn't bother to reread. Counsel, you've mentioned disregarded evidence. Specify what that is. The attorney listed 2 eyewitness statements and an audio recording taken by a bystander, noting that neither was included in the trial court's findings. Calvin's gaze shifted briefly toward the gallery. More faces had joined since the morning, members of the local bar, reporters, and community observers who seemed to know there was more at stake here than a single appeal. Opposing counsel stepped forward. His tone was steady but carried a thread of urgency. Your Honor, the trial court found that those items lacked credibility and weight. The body-worn camera footage, which is in the record, provides the most reliable account. Calvin leaned slightly forward. And yet, if the camera's view is obstructed during the most critical moment, does it remain the most reliable? The attorney hesitated, choosing his words. In the absence of stronger evidence, yes, Your Honor. The courts have consistently given weight to the officer's testimony in such circumstances. Calvin let a pause stretch long enough for the words to land. Weight does not mean unquestioned acceptance. From the back, Andre Parker's eyes tracked every exchange, his expression unreadable. Jessica Morgan's fingers tapped once against her notepad before stilling again. The entire room seemed to be leaning forward, caught in the current of the questions. The arguments continued for nearly an hour, weaving through precedent, statutory interpretation, and procedural history. Calvin steered the discussion toward the standard of review, pressing both sides on the implications of affirming versus remanding. When the final rebuttal ended, Calvin closed the docket folder in front of him. The court will take the matter under advisement. A written opinion will issue in due course. The bailiff's voice rang out, announcing the recess. As Calvin stepped down from the bench, he could feel the weight of the gallery's eyes on him, not just the usual deference to a judge, but the focused gaze of people who sensed they had just witnessed a turning point, even if they couldn't yet name it. In the hallway outside, Palmer was waiting. "The sheriff's office just placed Miller on administrative leave," he said quietly, "effective immediately." Calvin didn't break stride. "That's their record to manage. I have mine." They walked on, the echo of their footsteps swallowed by the corridor's high ceilings, leaving behind a courtroom still buzzing with unspoken questions. The afternoon light had shifted by the time Calvin reached his chambers again, the gold edges of the blinds cutting long lines across the carpet. LaToya was at her desk with the phone pressed to her ear, jotting something on a yellow pad. She glanced up when he entered and mouthed, "Media," before returning to her call. He closed the door behind him and loosened the top clasp of his robe. The silence inside was heavy in a different way, not the tense quiet of a courtroom, but the kind that followed a full day of measured words and unyielding control. A knock came almost immediately. Palmer stepped in, holding a thin folder. "Judge, thought you should see this before it makes the rounds." He set the folder down and opened it to reveal a printed press release. The sheriff's office had chosen its language carefully, describing the incident as an interaction under review and assuring the public that appropriate administrative steps had been taken. Miller's name was included, but his rank and years of service were emphasized in equal measure. "They're framing it as a matter of department policy," Palmer said. Calvin scanned the page, his eyes pausing at certain phrases: good faith, procedural miscommunication, commitment to community trust, all carefully constructed to avoid any acknowledgement of legal fault. "Policy language for a public problem," Calvin said at last, setting the paper aside. Palmer folded his arms. "It'll buy them time, but not much. Reporters are already connecting the dots between Miller's stop last week and the appeal you heard today. Some are calling it symbolic. Others are asking if it's a conflict of interest." Calvin met his gaze. "The law doesn't operate on symbolism, and conflict of interest is defined by conduct, not conjecture." Palmer nodded, though his eyes held the weariness of someone who knew the media's appetite didn't slow for legal definitions. "Still, it's going to get louder." LaToya stepped in then, phone now cradled between shoulder and ear. "Judge, local station's asking for a comment. National outlet, too. I've told them no comment until the opinion is issued." "Keep telling them," Calvin said. Palmer closed the folder and picked it up. "You'll be in for a long week." Calvin allowed the faintest trace of a smile. "That's why the record matters. It's the one thing they can't rewrite once it's done." When the door shut again, he moved to his desk, pulled the case file closer, and began reviewing his notes. Outside, the courthouse square was starting to empty, but the last few clusters of reporters still lingered, their lenses trained on the entrance as if waiting for one more image to tie the day together. The blinds cast shifting shadows across the pages as the sun dropped lower. Each annotation, each underline in the file was a thread in the opinion he would draft, an opinion that would live far beyond the day's headlines. By the time the courthouse lights dimmed that evening, the story had already leapt from local feeds to national outlets. Satellite trucks parked along the street, their telescoping masts cutting into the skyline. Producers barked into headsets while correspondents rehearsed live segments under the glow of portable lights. In the sheriff's administrative offices, a small conference room was crowded with brass. Miller sat at the end of the table, his uniform shirt buttoned tight, jaw set hard. A departmental investigator slid a recording device onto the table. "This is an internal administrative review. You are on paid leave pending the outcome. You have the right to representation." Miller's response was clipped. "Noted." Across town, Jessica Morgan stood on the steps of the community center, answering questions from a local reporter. "This isn't just about one stop. It's about a pattern that's been ignored for too long. People are paying attention now." Behind her, Andre Parker kept a watchful eye on the crowd gathering to listen, his presence a quiet reassurance. Palmer, walking through the square toward his car, stopped to take a call. "Understood," he said into the phone. "No, the judge won't be making any statements. The opinion will speak for itself." He hung up and glanced toward the courthouse, the upper windows dark except for the faint light in Calvin's chambers. Inside, Calvin sat at his desk with the case file spread before him. The incident from the roadside played in his mind, the flash of lights, the weight of Miller's words, the measured way he'd stepped from the car with his cane. He turned back to the transcripts, marking passages in steady, deliberate strokes. On another floor, clerks moved between offices carrying boxes of records. LaToya sorted through new filings, noting how many referenced the earlier incident, even though it wasn't formally before the court. The public couldn't be separated from the case now. It had become part of its frame. At a diner on the edge of town, two off-duty deputies sat in a corner booth. One leaned in, speaking low. "You think he'll actually lose immunity?" The other shook his head. "Not likely, but with him off the street, things might calm down for a while." The night deepened, but the current didn't slow. Social media feeds churned with clips of courtroom exchanges, split-screened against footage from the roadside stop. In living rooms, coffee shops, and offices, the same question echoed, what would the judge do? In his chambers, Calvin set down his pen and closed the file. The outlines of his opinion were taking shape. It would not answer every question, nor could it erase the incident, but it would define the boundaries that the law required. Outside, the courthouse stood silent under the street lamps, its shadow stretching long over the square where reporters still waited, unwilling to leave before the next turn in the story. The next morning, Calvin arrived at the courthouse before sunrise. The streets were still slick from an overnight rain, the air carrying the cool bite of early morning. He unlocked his chambers and set his cane by the desk, placing the case file directly in the center. The blinds stayed shut. He needed quiet more than light. He began with the appellate record, rereading the trial court's factual findings line by line. Every omission and every unresolved contradiction stood out in sharper relief than it had during oral argument. The question wasn't just whether the officer had acted improperly, but whether the legal standard had been applied in a way that insulated conduct from review. On his desk, a second stack waited, past opinions from his own court on qualified immunity. Some had upheld it in the name of stability. Others had carved out exceptions to preserve constitutional accountability. Calvin flipped through them slowly, jotting notes in the margins. His handwriting was as even as his demeanor, but the choice he faced was no less pressing for that calm surface. At 9 sharp, Palmer stepped in. "You'll want to know the sheriff's office is accelerating their timeline. They're calling witnesses today." Calvin kept his eyes on the page. "Their timetable doesn't dictate ours." Palmer nodded, but lingered. "It's getting rough out there. People are treating your ruling like it's already written." Calvin looked up at last. "That's why it has to be right when it is." By mid-morning, he shifted to drafting mode. The opening paragraphs came first, setting the jurisdiction, framing the appeal. Then the factual background, crafted with deliberate neutrality, stripped of rhetoric but heavy with the record's details. His pen never rushed. Each sentence was a piece of the scaffolding that would hold the opinion upright against public scrutiny. In the hallway, LaToya intercepted another call from a national outlet. "No, the judge has no statement. You'll see it when it's filed." She hung up without waiting for a reply. Through the afternoon, Calvin worked without break except to pour a fresh cup of coffee. As the draft grew, he weighed phrases with the precision of someone who knew the wrong word could tilt an entire interpretation. The goal wasn't to write for headlines, it was to write something that would stand when the noise had faded. By evening, he had a full draft, still rough, but enough to see its spine. He leaned back, looking at the last paragraph. It didn't tie itself to the roadside stop by name, but the principle was there. The law demands scrutiny when authority is exercised at the edge of its limits. The opinion was filed on a Thursday morning, released at 10 a.m. sharp. Copies went to counsel first, then the press. The decision reversed the trial court and remanded for further proceedings, holding that disputed facts and disregarded evidence precluded summary judgment on qualified immunity. The language was measured, but the meaning was clear. The court would not shield conduct from examination simply because the available record was imperfect. Within an hour, the courthouse steps were packed. Cameras clicked as attorneys emerged, flanked by reporters eager to capture a soundbite. The appellant's counsel called it a reaffirmation that constitutional rights are not abstractions. Opposing counsel kept his remarks brief, noting only that his client would present a full defense on remand. Miller did not appear. The sheriff's office issued a terse statement acknowledging the ruling and confirming that the internal investigation remained active. Off the record, a deputy hinted that the leave status would not be lifted. In the community, the reaction was immediate. Local radio stations opened their lines to callers, some praising the court for demanding accountability, others warning that officers would hesitate to act decisively in the field. At the community center, Jessica Morgan read the opinion aloud to a small group, her voice steady. Andre Parker stood nearby, hands folded over the head of his cane, listening without expression. In his chambers, Calvin read the public copy one last time before setting it aside. The courthouse around him buzzed with the energy of the day, but he remained still. The ruling was done, the record complete. What came next, the retrial, the department's choices, the public's memory, was beyond his role. He glanced toward the window. The square outside was full again, just as it had been on the afternoon of the hearing. Reporters, citizens, passers-by, all part of the larger picture that had framed this case from the start. Calvin closed the file, reached for his cane, and rose. Whatever else the headlines would say, the opinion itself would remain as written, a reminder that authority, no matter how entrenched, was never beyond the reach of review.